First, we'll look at the requirements for your 3D geometry, the overall structure of the program, and the navigation. Then we'll make our first projection and advance into the multi-camera projection to achieve consistency from all sides. In the middle of the video, we'll look at using the inpainting with colors and inpainting with masks via the workflow modes. We'll also look at working with separate sub-objects, fusing and improving the quality of projections via the total object auto-masking mode. Next will be the backgrounds, followed by the SDXL networks and the fine-tuning of the depth. We'll finish by looking at making albedo-like textures with the help of Albedo LoRA. It will reduce shadows and gloss if you need a PBR workflow. Stable Projectorz consists of 3 parts. The main view window, which contains our 3D model. The left panel, which will always remain the same. And on the right, we got the panel with 4 different tabs. So it will show different controls depending on which tab we are in. Let's go into the 3D tab and import our 3D object. You can use FBX, OBJ, or GLB, and it's important that your geometry contains texture coordinates, properly unwrapped and they are not overlapping. In 3ds Max or Blender, you can inspect your object. In my case, it consists of 3 parts, the blade, the guard, and the handle. And if I unwrap all of them at once, it's important that even though they are separate objects, their UVs are non-overlapping. So this object is unfolded onto a 2D surface and is going to be ready to read the texture. You can see the blade is not overlapping any other parts, and they all respect each other, even though they are separate objects. For advanced users, yes, you can use udims. You can simply move your stuff to another udim, and that's especially useful in case if you have symmetrical objects. Because symmetry doesn't really work in Stable Projectorz unless the left half of your model is on the first udim and the right half is on the second udim, and so on. Next to the input panel, we have the brush controls, so you can change the size of the brush by clicking and dragging left and right. The hardness of the brush is to be changed here. Let's use the medium one for now. And also the direction of the brush is right here. You can flick between erase and add by using the X on your keyboard. And here is the workflow mode. It is very important, but for now, let's keep it on the projection masking. Let's also have a look at the ControlNet tab. This is the small neural network which helps StableDiffusion understand the overall shape of the geometry. So if I move my model somewhere to the top right corner, this little ControlNet will be the thing that helps StableDiffusion render in the top right corner. And we've got to send it some kind of image. You can right-click this preview and select what we're going to be sending. This one expects a black and white representation, the depth representation of the scene. So I'm going to be picking the depth. But you might also want to send normals, which are the directions of your polygons, the colors of your scene, or the colors encoded in the vertices of your object. But in this case, this little depth ControlNet expects the black and white depth. It will not work with other input images. And you can also import your own custom image here in case if your ControlNet is something else, like an IP adapter. This way you can copy the style of an image and so on. So depth image for the little depth ControlNet. The preprocessor is none because we don't want to enhance our image any further. The depth that we are sending is already perfect in itself. With middle mouse drag, you can pan around, Alt left drag to orbit around, Alt right drag to zoom in and out. You can always use the scroll wheel, of course, and hold the right mouse button to look around, which is useful in case if you are inside of a room. While holding the right mouse button, you can also use the WASD keys to walk around, like in the FPS game. And while holding the same right mouse button, you can also use the Q and E to fly up and down. If you lost your model and you can't find it, hover the main view window and press F to focus it. Middle mouse click allows you to focus on a specific detail to orbit around that section. For example, this gem, I've middle clicked and I can rotate just around it. And F to focus on the entire thing, to spin around the center of the whole model. Because it consists of several meshes, in my case the blade and the handle, I can control and click on them to hide them away. This will allow me to work just on one single part of it. I can always press Ctrl A to select everything and Ctrl D to hide everything. And then holding Ctrl, I can gradually reveal the pieces that I need. Let's make our first render. I'm going to specify what I expect. It highlights the nouns in color, making it easier for us to see the overall structure of the prompt and to remember what sort of things we have in here. Let's also specify what we don't want to see. low quality, low resolution, smudge and blur, and so on. You can add more things, but be careful not to overdo it because you might constrain your neural network and it will be afraid of doing anything. Maybe 4 more additional lines. Let's also pick the actual neural network that will be rendering things. By default, we're only going to have realistic vision, which is of type SD 1.5, so it works together with the SD 1.5 ControlNet. If your network is heavy, for example, if it's SDXL, then you need to watch out so that your ControlNet is also of the XL type. Otherwise, you're going to have errors here. The two must match together. This one already has the VAE built in it, so we're going to keep the VAE as none. It is like a color filter that helps your images to remain juicy, colorful, and saturated. Sampler is the algorithm with which your neural network will be extracting the image from the white noise. And here is how many steps it will think about when extracting the image. 10 is good for testing, and 20 is good for final results. But it depends on the network that you're using. CFG is how much do you force the network to listen to the text, but if you keep overdoing it, then it will start to freak out and start to hallucinate. If you keep it very low, then it's not going to be paying much attention to what you've specified here, and it's going to be more creative. If you've been playing around with sliders, dragging them left and right, you can restore them to the default value by simply right-clicking them, and it recovers the original value. For example, the field of view can also be right-clicked. Let's generate 2 images at once, twice, so 4 of them. If your GPU is not very powerful, then keep generating 1 image at a time and just increase the number of repetitions here. This small neural network was trained on billions of little images, so it's only good for generating small images of about 512 resolution size. For larger sizes, like 1000, it will start to hallucinate. For 1000, you should use not SD 1.5, but the heavy SDXL networks, and also the XL control nets. I'm going to use 512, or maybe we still can push it to a slightly higher resolution, do something like that. I'm going to zoom up on the object to make sure that as much of this 768 by 768 image lands on the surface of the sword. I want to capture as many pixels as possible, and I'm going to hit Generate Art. This network starts to work in tandem with this control net and begins to process the image. You can go into the black window and see the overall progress. We can see that the base model, which is this little neural network, and the control net right here, they're already loaded in the memory. Here is how much of memory everything takes, including the memory required for overall computation. And I'm left with about 7 gigs of free space on my GPU. So the two work very well and they fit in the memory of my graphics card. But if you see a negative number here, you might want to use this low VRAM button on the control net, and it might be just enough to squeeze both of them into the memory of your graphics card. And we can see that the render has already completed in about 46 seconds. So I'm going to jump into the Arts tab, and I'm presented with 4 different images. Let's untoggle the wireframe to see it better. And we're looking for something that doesn't contain gloss or shadows, because we want to illuminate our object later on in the game engine or during the game. But we can always remove the gloss and shadows using inpaint. There are also things such as Albedo LoRas. Those will render just pale colors that don't have shadows nor gloss, and I'll touch up on them closer to the end of this tutorial. So for now, let's pick one of the images that we like the most. We can only pick one single image from the entire generation group, so I'm going to discard the remaining 3 by clicking this Delete Non-Selected button and dispose of the 3 images so that they don't take up the GPU memory. If we orbit around, we can see that the other side hasn't been rendered yet, so we can repeat this as well and try to match both the front and the back. But Stable Projectorz contains a very powerful tool, which is the multi-view projection that will allow us to achieve consistency without us having to render manually several sides. It will just do it at once. To use the multi-view, I'm going to increase the number of cameras to 4 and click on the sorting button. I can then use the scroll wheel to zoom out and Alt left mouse drag to orbit around. Middle mouse dragging allows me to position each camera, and if your object is not centered on the number, you should hover the number and press F to focus onto the current camera. So I have the front, I also want to do the back, and I can press Ctrl to snap to the nearest 45 degrees. And I also want the sides, so I'm going to do this direction and also the opposite side. This way I'm capturing all of the directions and going to be texturing the object from all the sides. As you are positioning the objects, you should watch out so that you don't accidentally overlap them. Also, avoid wasting any kind of space. For example, if I were to place them like this, there is a lot of wasted space here at the top and at the bottom. This way, I'm ensuring that the surfaces are capturing as many of the pixels as possible from the projection. I would like to specify a wooden dungeon door inside an old stone arc, a highly detailed game asset. And in the negative prompt, low quality and resolution, bad art, smudge and blur. Another important thing is that if we look at the depth representation of our scene, what we are sending to our ControlNet, the StableDiffusion will look at those 4 shapes and might think that you are expecting 4 different things, like maybe a red door, a green door, and a wooden door. That's not what we want. We want to exclude any kind of variation. So in the negative prompt, in the brackets, I'm going to put variance, multiple choice, and also let's do strong lighting with hard shadows, because I want to avoid shadows and gloss if possible. Let's stick a colon 1.2 to make it stand out from the remainder of the negative keywords, disable the depth preview, and also let's increase the resolution even further. This resolution would be too much, but in reality, when you give such high resolutions, the networks tend to stack up things and to duplicate things. In our case, we've stacked up our doors on top of each other, so this kind of collage is what we are actually expecting. So in this particular case, we are allowed to increase the resolution even higher. Even though the entire resolution is 1000 by 1000, each object is going to be capturing only about a quarter of it, so like 512 by 512. That's why increasing the resolution is important. And typically for higher resolutions, you'd want to reduce the number of images, but just for the sake of the example, I'm going to put 6 images. Going to press Generate Art, jump into the Arts panel to see what sort of images are being prepared. And let's also disable the wireframe here. The green tick is enabled. It temporarily reduces the speed of stable projectors, but helps StableDiffusion to complete its rendering faster and easier. Now we have to pick the image that has the most consistency, so that the door looks the same from different directions. Don't worry about the stretches, we're gonna soon fix it using the blending. I think this one looks the most interesting, it doesn't have too many shadows, and it does have the consistency that I need. So with it selected, I'm going to delete non-selected images. And now I can jump into the blend cameras mode. You can see that there are 4 cameras that we've used. By shift right drag, I'm going to increase the brush size to look at where the camera number 4 is shining from. We can see that the camera number 4 wants to shine from this direction onto the object, and the other cameras, like camera number 3, are from opposite sides. Camera number 2, for example, is for shining from the back direction, and the first one wants to shine from the front outwards. So now I'm going to shift right drag to reduce the brush size, and with brush of strength 100, so 0 on my keyboard, and you can also use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. But with 100% strength, for the first camera, I'm going to paint it at the front to make sure that this camera has the full influence over any other cameras, specifically for the front. For this direction, this first camera is not very useful, but we have another one, number 3, I think, which is perfect for shining from this side. So with the third one selected, with a positive brush, I'm going to paint the third camera here on the side to make sure that it has full influence from this direction. And don't worry about the seams, we'll fix those using the inpaint soon. For now, it's just a rough blending that we're looking for. For this direction from the back, it's the camera number 2. So I'm going to select the camera number 2, and with a positive brush, I'm going to establish 100% influence of this camera by simply painting at the back of the door. And if you've painted too much, for example, if you started to paint here, you might accidentally show the stretching of the second camera. If that happens, simply switch to the third camera, and with a positive brush, recover the third camera here. Let's also do the other side, the fourth one, but instead of constantly moving your brush to click on the camera, simply press F1, F2, F3, and F4. This is very comfortable and helps you to change the cameras very quickly without moving your mouse. So F4 to select the fourth camera, I can see that it's very useful for this direction. And also here I can see if I hover my mouse, I get a little preview of what the current camera number 4 wants to do. So I might want to have a smoother blend. That's why I'm going to press 3 on my keyboard to have the brush strength of 30%. So positive brush. For the fourth camera, I'm going to do a couple of taps here, a more gradual transition. Like this, we're able to set up the general blend and have the overall door prepared for us initially. Next, we're going to improve the insides of the door here and here using inpaint and the workflow modes that we see on the right. Let's switch to the color mode and sample a color from a neutral surface, like from here. I'm going to Alt and left click to sample a color, and you can see it's loaded in here. So in this color mode, with a positive brush, with about 60% strength, 6 on my keyboard, reduce the brush size, shift right drag, and paint a couple of times. Alt left click, and also from here. If I accidentally painted too much, I can always erase my stuff using the eraser brush. In the color mode, I'm going to erase whatever I've painted. I'd like to hide away all the blackness so that when in painting, StableDiffusion doesn't consider any kind of black areas and doesn't try to reproduce or blend with them. And it's important to pick a correct angle so that I can look at the painted surface as straight ahead as possible. So I want to pick the most perpendicular angle, but I would still want the overall shape to make sense, so that the overall shape still makes sense to StableDiffusion with the prompt, and so that we can see our colors as well. Zoom up as close as possible without losing the overall context, and let's reduce the resolution down to 700 or even 512, because we're working with just one single camera and our little neural network is more comfortable with smaller resolutions. The final setting that we need to consider is how much we're going to be rethinking or redoing our painted stuff. So let's reconsider it by approximately 60%. That's a very important setting, and you might need to play around with it. Because if you do it too little, then it will not change your painting too much, and you'll be able to see the colors, but we'll see that they're painted. And if you increase the redo too much, then it will be blending perfectly, but it might start to lose the information about the colors that we've painted. I don't quite like those things that I've been given, so I'm going to delete the last generation, switch back to the color mode, and increase the redo to something maybe like 70%. Okay, that's better. There is much less blur happening, and we're getting more details. But it starts to draw some kind of shadows and introducing the shading. So it pays less attention to our colors, but the stuff looks more detailed. So 70% kind of works. I'm going to select this first image, delete all the other, and repeat the process for the other side. So if I switch back to the color mode, I have my previously painted colors. I could erase them using the eraser, but it's much quicker to just click on the erase bucket tool, which will destroy the painted colors while in the painted color mode. Going to Alt click here to sample the color, and with a brush strength of 60%, going to put a couple of taps, adding a little bit of shadow here for the connection, maybe with just 20% strength, so it's not too apparent. Looking as perpendicular as possible at this painting, and keeping the overall shape so that StableDiffusion still is able to understand where the dungeon door is, where the stone arch is, and so on. You can also change the field of view, by the way. It will change the angle at which your surfaces are being projected. So you can see with the higher field of view, the sides are hiding away from us, but we're starting to see more of the insides. Whereas if we reduce the field of view, then the sides are starting to appear more and more and start to face the camera more and more, but we are losing the ability to see the inside of the door. Lower field of view is good for texturing the outsides because more of the surfaces are looking towards the camera, and higher field of views are good for texturing the inside of the room, and so on. I'm going to pick the angle of 40, look as straight as possible, and make sure that the entire thing is visible to StableDiffusion. The resolution is good. It's slightly higher than the default one. We have only one camera. The redo is 70%. Going to generate the art. Stable Projectorz is clever enough to recognize that you've painted colors and then to figure out the zone in which it should project. So you saw as I was hovering the gen art, it was showing the orange color around my painted stuff. It's going to be the zone where the projection will appear. So the 70% redo did a good job. I would say this one wins because this variant has some kind of glow and shadow that I don't like. And remember that you can always press R to see where your projection is currently coming from. And you can also hover the icon or right-click it and use the far and the soft sliders to smooth out the borders of your projection. It can be very useful in case if you can see stretches happening on some shallow angles. So you can use the far slider to quickly hide away transitions. You can see it happening here. Of course, you can right-click to restore them to the default value. You can also fix it manually. Inside of the projection masking mode, you can fix the current projection. So I'm going to hold R. And I can see that this projection selected in red is appearing here and is actually causing this thing to happen right here. So in the projection masking mode, eraser, 20% strength, tap a few times to remove it. Maybe 100% strength would be more reasonable. So like this, I'm able to clean up the projection and get rid of the seams that it's causing. Hold Control and hover your icons to see where they're landing on the model if you see some kind of stretch and you're wondering where it comes from. So now let's fix the seams on the side here. And you could jump to the color, remove the painted stuff using the bucket tool, and start to sample the colors like this. But I just want to show you that you can use already existing colors without painting your own. Let's remove the painted stuff and switch to the no color mode. This allows us to draw a mask that doesn't dictate any colors, but just asks for the generation to happen here. And when you're using these masks, make sure that your brush size is as soft as possible. So maybe this softness or medium one, since it gives StableDiffusion a chance to do a better blending. And also maybe here. But we want to look at them perpendicularly and make sure that the entire object is visible. Resolution is appropriate. And maybe let's reduce the field of view so that more of the surfaces are looking towards us. 70% rethink and generate art. We are already on a single camera for quite a long time. The resolution is appropriate for a single camera, but our prompts might be slightly outdated because we're using variants, multiple choice, and so on, but that's only useful for multiple cameras. So we could take this prompt and copy it into another tab. In this tab, I'm gonna remove variants and multiple choice, but maybe keep the strong lighting with hard shadows because I still don't want to see it on my models. And if I later decide to come back and that I need the variants, I can always press on this tab and recover my original prompt. But right now I want this one, and this way they're more up to date. We are presented with another batch of 6 images, so I'll say this one is good enough. You can hide the current generation by pressing this H button and show it back, or you can use the Q button as a shortcut. That's very useful if you've been playing around with projections and want to see where the current projection is being applied. So I have it selected here, and I can press Q to show and hide it. Holding R, of course, allows me to see its area of influence like this. So by pressing Q, I can see that it did some improvement here, but also introduced a white streak right here. Middle mouse click to orbit around this zone. Using the eraser in the projection masking mode with this projection, I'm going to erase a little bit from here. I think it's a good time to look at texturing the separate meshes. Control D to hide everything, pressing Control and clicking on the door to bring it back. And I'm going to press F to focus on it, and we can see that it contains some issues on the sides. And also we can see if I press Shift W or enable the wireframe that the door ring handle is being lost right now. I think it makes sense to Alt-click the color to enter the color mode, and then to brush on the sides of the door like so. And also I want to get rid of the shadow, so going to sample a nearby color and paint away the shadow. Shift W to enable the wireframe, clicking on the door ring to make it easier to rotate around it. Increase the number of cameras to 2 and have one side of the door next to another side. And because the door is a small object compared to the entire model, I'm going to say that 768 by 768 should be enough, even though there are 2 objects in front of us. So each one will be getting around 300 pixels in the width and 300 in the height. The prompt still makes sense, except that we don't want to have any kind of stone arc. I'll copy this away into another tab, then remove the old stone arc. Let's increase the redo to approximately 60% to make sure that most of our colors are hidden and that we're getting nice details. And in the color mode, I'm going to generate art. It's important to recognize that StableDiffusion is being sent only these two shapes, so it will only look at the image and generate as if it's only this object that exists in front of it. It doesn't know about the stone arch anymore. It's currently hidden, and we're only showing the silhouettes of those two doors. Another thing I noticed is that we're not using the variants. However, the current results look good. I'm going to disable the wireframe and check out what sort of things we're getting. I think this one is sufficient. It's good. Doesn't have too many shadows. The details are adequate, and we're also able to see some kind of ring. But it might be worth improving this. Let's jump into the blend cameras. And we're not going to be currently blending the cameras, but I just want to be on a single camera like this. Use the no color, erase the brush stuff, paint here, and specify that I want to have a door handle. So a wooden door with a ring door handle. Let's put this in brackets and give it a weight of 1.1, just so that it's more noticeable among other words. Let's zoom up to capture as much of the pixels as possible. Redo, let's say 70%, and rethink this particular region. I'll keep this one and do the same thing for the opposite side. Use the no color, and also I'd like to improve the situation that's happening around the edge here. 70% rethink, 6 images, and the prompt is good. The main idea of multiple cameras is that they allow us to achieve consistency. And then we are able to improve certain pieces using a single camera, like I do right now, using the in-paint brushing. But multiple cameras give us the consistency on top of which we can build. So I can press R and see exactly where my projection is landing, and if needed, I can use the far and the soft slider, of course, to control the fall-off. But in this case, everything seems good, everything blends nicely. I can press Q to hide the current projection and inspect this region here. Maybe it hides this little green dot, and if I do like it, inside of the projection mask, using the eraser, I'm going to zoom up on it and reveal it. Press X to change back to the positive brush, change the brush strength to 40%, and make the transition slightly more soft. I also want to remove this stretching here. If you see pale colors here, consider getting a VAE and using it here. But in my case, everything seems to be working fine, so I just need to pick something that works best in this section. Pressing Q allows me to hide it to see the before and after. We could of course improve this section here, but you already know the process. It would be just the color, paint, and rethink. We have too many images, so make sure to clean up, so using the NS here. And if I Control A, I'm going to show back the entire thing. You can see that because we were working on the door separately from the entire object, it might look slightly different. So we can improve the situation by using the Total Object mode. This one just masks the entire object automatically for us. And if we redo by about 40% or 45%, it's going to reconsider the entire object with a 768, in this case, resolution, and reproject and rethink all the colors that it sees using 40% redo. This means that the colors beneath the entire mask are going to blend together better. So here is the before, and here is the after. Maybe the resolution was too little. 1K might be too much, but because we are rethinking an already existing image, it might not be a big issue compared to generating from scratch. And if we hold R, we can see exactly where the projection is landing. I'm going to use the far slider here to soften up the transition. And it does help to blend the door better. The thing is, without this far slider, you'll see stretches happening here. If you do spot them later on, and you're wondering where they're coming from, you can press Ctrl, hover your icon, and find out exactly what sort of thing is causing it. So I can see it highlights in red when I Control hover the icon, signifying that it's this particular projection that is causing it. So in the projection mask mode, using the eraser, I can come and tap a few times to remove that, because I found out the icon that's causing this problem. And also, this particular projection is causing issues around the door handle. I'm losing details, so I would like to zoom up on it, maybe middle mouse click to orbit around it. Hold R, and using the eraser, projection mask, I'm going to free up the colors of this door handle so that they're not being affected by the projection. Pressing Q to hide the current projection, I can see that it does make a difference here. So with it shown, projection mask, eraser, I'm going to remove it from here as well. And if you ever want to import your custom textures, you can do so by hovering this custom UV text to import an image to wrap around your object. Another important thing to keep in mind is the overall resolution of your scene. So for example, if you do decide to zoom up on this object here, and for some reason make a 1000 by 1000 projection, all of those pixels are going to be applied to this region. So even if you zoom out, this thing is going to be still 1024 by 1024. But there is a concept of entire resolution for the whole scene. And to control the resolution for the whole scene, we have these two buttons here, the minus and the plus. So if I reduce the resolution down to, for example, 256, you can see that everything starts to look very blurry because I'm capping the overall scene resolution, the final resolution of the total texture, just down to this number. And if you keep going down, you also have the option to use the point filter, which allows you to achieve a pixelated look if your game is in the pixelated art style. Let's use bilinear and increase the resolution to a 2K or even 4K. That's especially important when you're about to save your results. To save, just click Export, specify if you want to have a JPEG. It's much more compact than PNG, but doesn't have transparency. Otherwise, it's going to be PNG by default. And when I look at it, it's the UV space image with the nice dilation occurring around the edges. This thing here will help you avoid the seams around your UV chunks. But if you don't want this stretching, you can simply export using a no dilation. It is also possible to export whatever the camera sees. These colors combine together with the depth by using the Export Views button. Make sure to save often, just in case, and you also have the ability to save and load your project. In case if the project ever becomes corrupt, the data folder next to your save file will contain a file called Final Composite 4K. You can always find this file and load it like a normal UV texture to continue working on your stuff. We are able to render 2D images, the backgrounds, that will affect other projections on our 3D model. Let's go into the Art PG and in a new tab, specify something interesting, like a rye field, nature, and the beautiful sky. For the negative prompt, I'm just going to remove everything from here, strong lighting with hard shadows, and it's important to disable the shape recognition. So I'm going to click here to turn off my ControlNet, or inside of the ControlNet step, I can just collapse it like this. And I can look away, change the resolution to something like 700, and create several images. Head on to Art PG, and then I want to show you how this background affects the further projections. So if I go into the Arts tab and delete everything, I'm going to position my object somewhere here so that we still see the background. Enable the shape recognition, so I'm going to enable my ControlNet, preprocessor none, depth, sending the depth image, and create 4 images. So you can see how much the background is influencing projections on your 3D models. It can be used to set a certain vibe and keep specific lighting. Watch out so that your backgrounds don't have such a strong light, otherwise you're going to have issues like these. To avoid strong lighting like so, in the backgrounds you can blur the actual background using this slider to kind of hide away the rough transitions in light, but pay attention because backgrounds will actually affect the outcome. You can also load your own custom backgrounds, for example this kind of gradient, and when you generate stuff with the correct prompt, the background will influence the outcome. The generated projections are seen in the Arts tab, and you can see that the door is being blended into this gradient. So it does affect the vibe and does affect the overall style. You can use the backgrounds together with multiple cameras to achieve extra consistency. But backgrounds can reduce your resolution slightly and make your projections appear noisy. However, they can be used for the first pass and then refined using the null color, the color, or the total object. It's also important to remember to zoom up as close as you can, not to waste any empty space when sending your 768 pixels outwards onto the 3D surface. If you're one of the lucky users who has GPU with 8 gigs of RAM or above, you can use large SDXL networks along with a special thing that helps you to remove shadows and glossiness. So right now I'd like to show you how to load an SDXL network, how to connect an XL control net, and how to download this little LoRa helper network that will be removing shadows and highlights for you. First of all, you want to get the SDXL neural network. For example, on Civit AI website, there is a really cool one in November of 2024 called RealViz XL version 5.0. You can click on this button and download the neural network. It weighs 6.5 gigabytes, so it's a pretty big neural net. You want to drop it into the folder where the stable projectors is located. So you can see the executable is here. And the folder that you're looking for is called StableDiffusion WebUI Forge, the WebUI folder, and inside of it, modals folder and the StableDiffusion folder. So you can drop the large downloaded safe tensors file. And now we need to get the control net. The one that we're looking for is called Diffuser's XL Depth Full, which is 2.5 gigabytes. It's a pretty big control net. And you can find it in the SD control collection by Elias Wiel on the Hugging Face. So to get this large neural network, just click on this arrow and it will grab this 2.5 gigabytes file. But you might also want to experiment with the medium one. Its shape recognition is worse, but it's significantly more compact. So consider using this one if your GPU doesn't have too much VRAM. And finally, you want to get this little helper LoRa network. It's also going to be on the Hugging Face. The place is called Texture Synthesis SDXL LoRa, and it's by the Dog God. The file that you're looking for is called Texture Synthesis 3D Base Condensed Safe Tensors. You can click on this arrow and download the file. So you're supposed to drop the control net in the folder where Stable Projectorz executable is, in the StableDiffusion WebUI Forge, WebUI, modals, and control net. That's where the control net is supposed to go. And this little LoRa file should go into the LoRa folder. You can see it's here. Finally, restart Stable Projectorz, and it's a black WebUI window. This way it will register the new neural networks, and you'll be able to use them. So inside of Stable Projectorz, you can see I've got RealViz version 5.0, and it's a special type of SDXL network, which is the Lightning network. This means that this specific network is designed to use much fewer number of steps, not 20, but between 4 and 6. So it's able to generate images with a very little number of iterations. And the CFG scale should be between 1 and 2. So it listens to the text in a very sensitive way. And of course, because this is a large SDXL network, your images are supposed to be around 1000 by 1000 resolution. Let's also make sure that we activate our control net. In the dropdown, you're supposed to see the Diffuser's XL Depth Full. Select that one. The XL works well with the SDXL neural network. Let's enter a positive prompt. And before we hit the generate, there is one more thing, which is very tricky. You're supposed to use the correct sampler. So if we jump into the RealViz XL landing page, you are meant to use the DPM++ SDE Keras or DPM++ SDE as a sampler. So you should not be using the DPM++ to M Keras. We're meant to use DPM++ SDE. So let's pick that. Otherwise, we're going to get ugly results. It's right here. If we look at it once again, you can see that it specifies the settings for the Lightning modal. This one is the Lightning modal, and also the settings for the turbo modals, because this author has created several networks and they're just pasting the description between those neural networks. So this one is Lightning, but sometimes different neural networks might be turbo. Correct sampler, correct resolution, correct number of steps, correct CFG scale, SDXL network with the XL control net. Zoom up slightly more and do the first generation to check up on the results. I'm going to tick this checkbox to speed up the generation and wait for the result. So if we jump into the art panel and disable the wireframe, we can see that the XL control network, its shape recognition, is way too strong. It picks up on the very subtle details of our geometry and represents this in its generations. So we need to adjust the depth that we're sending to our control net, and for that, let's enable the depth and blur the depth by about 60%. You also want to reduce the contrast to approximately 35. The edge allows you to prevent blurring in case if there is some kind of snap between the depth. So for example, I can increase the edge threshold, and you can see that the blur doesn't go across the door here anymore, but it still peeks through this portion here. I can keep increasing the threshold, and you can see that the blur no longer happens here nor here, but I'm going to right-click it to keep it at the default value. And also there is this thing that is like a post-processing blur that just is getting applied to the entire shape, so you can use it to do an additional pass on top of the other blur. But I'll keep it as 0. And these settings you should probably remember. For SDXL networks, you should be using lower contrast and high blur. I'm going to disable the depth. We'll copy the seed so that the generation follows the same path, and retry. So now we're sending it a depth that is much smoother, and hopefully we're going to get a look that has less of the wireframe. And right now our SDXL is generating shadows and some highlights. So it might be a good time now to activate our LoRA and see how it's doing its thing. Inside of our LoRA folder, you can remember that we have a network called Texture Synthesis 3D Base Condensed. You can click on it and copy its name. And inside of the text prompt, let's put inside of the special tokens a LoRA, put a colon, and then paste the name of the network. And also a colon at the end, and do 1.0, which is going to be the weight for this LoRA network. So now that we've activated this LoRA by including it in the text prompt, it will be working along with our Lightning network and along with our XL depth ControlNet. It's active here, but we still need to give it a special keyword so that it knows what to work on. If we go onto the page of that LoRA, not in the files and versions, but in the modal card, we can scroll down and see a collection of trigger words. For example, we are looking for the AMB map, Ambient Occlusion texture. We can copy this thing, put it somewhere at the end of our prompt, and we are also given on the page an example prompt. So for example, a front-right view of a albedo map of a high-quality 3D model of a croissant. So I'm going to copy this thing and paste it into another tab here, then take out the things that I'm interested in. I'm going to take this and paste it in my main prompt. So space, pasting it, and putting a space here as well to make sure that it's separate words. The most important thing is that I'm specifying AMB map, the color map, muted realistic colors, and also it might be good to specify albedo. But don't overdo it, because if you put too many words, they might start to be more important than your main prompt. So we've activated our LoRA, and we've specified special trigger words for it. We have the same seed, so the generation will follow the same path. And we can generate art and see what sort of difference it makes. So you can see it does remove lots of shadows. It looks a lot more muted. So in the art tab, here is what we got with the LoRA. And if I hide it by pressing Q, that's the same thing, but without the LoRA. A drastic improvement. So we're able to get albedo-like textures without shadows and glossiness. As a final test, let's try the multi-view projection with the SDXL. So I'm gonna select 4 cameras, sort them, zoom them out, make sure I can see the back, the front, and 2 sides. Make sure there is no overlap so that I'm grabbing as much of the projection pixels as possible. You can increase the resolution beyond the default one, but I'm gonna keep it like this for now. Remember about the steps, the CFG scale, and the correct sampler for this particular neural network. We've got the LoRA active along with its trigger words. You can click on the blend cameras and work with the cameras by pressing F1, F2, F3, and F4. If you hover over the icon, the SFT slider, in case of multi-view projection, always helps you to get the initial blend around these areas where they connect together. So check out what's happening if I zoom up on this region and use the SFT slider. So it does set the initial blending, which might be useful to you if you want to save time blending your textures. So to recap, the first step is to achieve consistency from all sides at once using the multi-view projection. Then we can use the color or no color to cover the remaining missing bits. We can isolate on different objects by control-clicking on them, and then later on we can fuse them all together using the total object to mask the whole thing. And of course we can use the far and the soft sliders when we're working with a single camera. Always pay attention to the resolution that you're using, especially if you are on a single camera, and the reduce slider that controls the amount by which StableDiffusion reconsiders the image and reconsiders the colors. You can enhance further your workflow by using backgrounds if you want to. Those can be blurred, you can upload your own custom backgrounds, and save your textures here via Save 2K. But always remember about the global scene resolution, which you can control using the plus and the minus buttons. And of course, for the SDXL modals, remember to activate the correct ControlNet and use the correct depth settings in case if your network is SDXL. Low contrast, higher blur, and appropriate sampler, depending on which settings the author of the network is expecting you to use. This covers the most important parts that we have currently in Stable Projectorz. Join our Discord community, showcase your work, and check out other cool things on this YouTube channel. For example, prompting by image, where you can use another ControlNet, provide your own custom file, and use an IP adapter with an appropriate preprocessor. I wish you good luck and happy asset generation.